I still remember the smell of that cake batter mixing in my old kitchen, the way flour dust floated in the air like tiny ghosts of the life I used to have. My hands weren't young anymore. They were tired hands, hands that had washed hospital sheets when my husband, Daniel Carter, was dying, hands that had learned how to count pennies at grocery stores in Ohio after he was gone, hands that still tried to do something gentle in a world that had not been gentle with me. Her name was Olivia Bennett. She was my daughter-in-law. And that day, I had baked a cake for her. I thought maybe, just maybe, it would soften something between us. But I didn't understand then that some hearts don't soften, they harden. It had taken me nearly 2 days to make it, not because it was complicated, but because I had to rest my back every few minutes. The doctor said it was arthritis, but I called it something else in my head, the weight of years. I used a recipe I used to bake for my own son, Michael Carter, when he was little. He used to sit on the kitchen counter in our old house in Dayton, swinging his legs, waiting impatiently for the frosting. "Mom," he would say, "don't burn it this time." And I would laugh and pretend to be offended, even though I knew he was right more times than I liked to admit. But Michael was grown now, a successful software engineer in San Francisco. He had a life that moved fast, like the city he lived in, and Olivia, his wife, moved even faster. When they visited me in Lowe's Angels that summer, I told myself I would be careful. I would not say too much. I would not be too much. That's what Olivia used to say when I called too often. "Claire," she would say, "you don't need to be too much. My name is Claire Carter. I am a widow." And that word, widow, changes how people look at you, like you are already half gone. That morning, I woke up early. The sun hadn't fully climbed over the rooftops yet, and the air still had that quiet emptiness that only exists before the world decides to start judging you again. I put on my old blue apron. It had a small tear near the pocket, but I didn't replace it. Something about it felt honest. I measured flour carefully. I cracked eggs one by one into the bowl. I stirred slowly because fast movements made my wrist ache. I remember whispering to myself, "It's just a cake, Claire, just a cake." But it wasn't just a cake. It was a message. It was me trying to say, I am still here. I still matter. I still know how to love without asking for anything back. When it came out of the oven, it wasn't perfect. The edges were slightly uneven. The frosting wasn't bakery smooth. I wrote Olivia's name on top in soft white icing anyway. My hands trembled as I did it. Not because I was afraid, but because I was hopping. They arrived around noon. Michael first, always polite, always distracted. He hugged me quickly, like a formality he had learned rather than something he felt. "Hey, Mom," he said, already checking his phone. Then Olivia stepped in. She wore a cream-colored dress, sunglasses pushed on top of her head, heels that clicked like authority against my wooden floor. She looked around my small house in California, the way people look at places. They think they will not stay in long. "Hi, Claire," she said, not quite smiling. I smiled too much. I always did that when I was nervous. "I made something," I said quickly, almost eagerly. "For you." Her eyes moved toward the kitchen counter, where the cake sat. For a moment, I thought I saw something like curiosity in her face. But it passed quickly. We sat at the table. Michael kept talking about work. Olivia barely touched her water. Then I brought the cake out. I placed it carefully in front of her like it was something sacred. "I thought maybe you'd like it," I said softly. "It's a recipe I used to make when Michael was small." There was a silence after that. A strange one. Not peaceful. Heavy. Olivia looked at it for a long time. Too long. Then she laughed. Not a warm laugh. A sharp one. "Claire," she said, leaning back in her chair, "what is this supposed to be?" My heart sank slightly. "It's a cake." "I can see that," she said, "but why does it look like that?" Michael finally looked up from his phone. "Babe, it's fine. It's just Mom being sweet." But Olivia didn't stop. She leaned forward, pointing at the frosting. This is messy, and the writing, it looks like a child did it. My fingers curled slightly under the table. I did my best, I said quietly. That was a mistake. Because in her world, best didn't mean anything unless it matched her standards. She stood up, slowly, walked toward the cake, and then she did something I will never forget. She picked it up, all of it, and dropped it into the trash can beside the counter. It landed with a soft, humiliating thud. For a second, I couldn't breathe. I just stared at the trash can, at something I had made with care, with memory, with love. Olivia, I whispered, why would you do that? She turned to me, her face calm. Because, Claire, she said, this isn't appropriate. We're not kids. We don't do homemade messes like this. Michael stood up. Olivia, that's enough. But she didn't even look at him. She looked at me, and then she said it. You need to understand your place. Something inside me cracked quietly. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just broke. I only wanted to make you happy, I said. She walked closer. And before I could step back, before I could even understand what was happening, her hand hit my cheek. The sound wasn't loud, but it echoed in my chest like thunder. Michael shouted, Olivia. But I wasn't looking at him. I was looking at the cake in the trash, at the frosting I had written carefully, at the hope I had baked into it. And I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not sadness, not even anger. Something deeper. Something like disappearing. I didn't mean to upset you, I said again, though my voice barely belonged to me anymore. Olivia grabbed her purse. We should go, she said to Michael. And just like that, they left. The door closed behind them with a soft click, and my house became too quiet. I stood there for a long time. I don't know how long. Maybe minutes. Maybe more. Eventually, I walked to the trash can. I took the cake out. It was ruined, of course. But I held it anyway. Because sometimes, people don't throw away just food. They throw away effort. They throw away dignity. They throw away you. And standing there in my small kitchen in Los Angeles, holding a broken cake in my shaking hands, I realized something I had been avoiding for a long time. I was not part of their life the way I thought I was. I was something they tolerated, not something they valued. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat by the window and watched the streetlights flicker. And for the first time since Daniel died, I didn't cry because I missed him. I cried because I finally understood what it meant to be alone while still being alive. And somewhere in that silence, I made a decision I didn't yet fully understand. This wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of something I had not expected. Something I was not prepared for. But something I could no longer avoid. Because when someone throws away your love, they don't just end a moment. They start a chain of moments you can never unseen. After that night, something in me stopped responding the way it used to. Not my body. It still moved the same way, still woke up at the same time, still made tea out of habit rather than desire. But something deeper, something quieter had gone still. Morning came again in Los Angeles like it always did, indifferent and bright, as if nothing in the world had changed. I remember sitting at the edge of my bed for a long time, my hands resting on my knees, staring at the floor as if it might explain what had happened the day before. The silence of my house felt different now. Before, it had been loneliness. Now, it felt like judgment. I kept thinking about Olivia Bennett's face when she looked at me, not the anger, not even the slap itself, though my cheek still carried a faint soreness. What stayed with me was her calmness, as if she had done something completely ordinary, as if I was the one who had misunderstood the rules of the world I was standing in. Michael didn't call that night, not even a message. I checked my phone more times than I wanted to admit, each time pretending it was accidental. Each time feeling a small disappointment I told myself not to feel. I made breakfast I didn't eat. Toast sat on a plate getting cold while I stared out of the window. The neighborhood outside was alive in the way neighborhoods are when people have somewhere to go. Cars leaving driveways, dogs pulling on leashes, someone laughing in a way that didn't sound forced. I wondered when I stopped being part of that kind of world. It must have been after Daniel died. My husband, Daniel Carter, had been the kind of man who made ordinary days feel anchored. He worked in logistics, nothing glamorous, nothing that made people turn their heads at dinner parties. But he had a steadiness to him that made life feel like it had edges you could hold on to. When he got sick, everything softened too quickly. Hospitals became our second home. The smell of antiseptic replaced the smell of coffee in our mornings. Conversations turned into medical terms I didn't fully understand, but learned to repeat anyway, because repeating them made me feel like I still had control. I remember sitting beside his hospital bed in Ohio, holding his hand while he tried to pretend he wasn't afraid. "Claire," he said once, his voice thin, "don't let the world make you smaller than you are." I didn't understand what he meant then. I think I understand it now. Because the world had been trying for a long time. And Olivia Bennett was just one face of it. That morning after the cake, I didn't leave the house. I told myself I was resting, but really I was avoiding the idea of being seen. I didn't want a neighbor to ask how I was. I didn't want to perform fine for anyone. I stayed in the living room and looked through old photo albums instead. There was one of Michael as a child missing 2 front teeth, holding a baseball bat too big for him. Daniel was behind him, laughing, his hand resting on our son's shoulder like he was afraid the world might try to pull him away. In that photo, I looked younger. Not beautiful, not in any dramatic sense, but softer, less aware of endings. I traced my finger over Daniel's face for a long time. "I'm still here," I whispered, though I wasn't sure who I was saying it to. By afternoon, my phone finally rang. "Michael." I stared at his name before answering, as if preparing myself for impact. "Hi, Mom," he said. His voice was careful, measured, like he was walking through something fragile. "Hi," I replied. There was a pause. One of those pauses where both people are deciding who will step into discomfort first. "About yesterday," he started. I closed my eyes slightly. "I'm sorry," he said quickly. "Olivia shouldn't have done that or said those things." I waited. "But," I asked quietly, because there is always a but in conversations like these. Another pause. "She's been under a lot of stress at work," he said. "You know how she is. She didn't mean it the way it came out." I listened to his voice carefully. There was something missing in it, not guilt, not anger, something like distance. "I see," I said. "No," he added quickly. "I don't think you do. I talked to her. She said she regrets it." That word, regrets, landed differently in my chest. Regret is easy when it costs nothing. "I just don't want things to be weird between everyone," Michael continued. "We're a family." Family. That word used to mean something warm to me. Now it felt like a concept people used when they wanted silence to replace accountability. "I understand," I said again. But I didn't think I did. After we hung up, I sat there holding the phone longer than necessary. My thumb hovered over the screen as if I might call someone else, but there was no one else. That was the truth I kept circling around without wanting to look at directly. I was no longer at the center of anyone's urgency. Days passed in a slow blur after that. I went to the grocery store once. A young cashier smiled at me too quickly, the kind of smile people give when they are trained to be kind but not instructed on what to do with sadness. I bought too much bread, too many eggs, things that implied a future I wasn't fully convinced I would use. At home, I started baking again. Not because I wanted to. Because I didn't know what else to do with my hands. The second cake I made came out worse than the first. I didn't even bother frosting it properly. I ate a slice alone at the kitchen table, tasting nothing except texture. Dry sponge, slight sweetness, no memory attached to it anymore. Still, I kept baking. Something about repetition felt safer than thinking. A week later, Michael came to visit alone. When I opened the door, he looked different, tired in a way that wasn't just physical. The kind of tired that comes from being in the middle of conflicting loyalties for too long. "Hey, Mom," he said softly. I stepped aside and let him in. He glanced around the house like he was checking if anything had changed since the last time he was there. I noticed how his eyes avoided the kitchen counter where the cake incident had happened. "I brought coffee," he said, lifting a cup slightly like an offering. We sat in the living room, the same place where laughter used to echo when Daniel was alive. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then Michael exhaled. "She really did feel bad," he said. I nodded slowly. "I don't think she knows how to deal with people like you," he added. I looked at him then. "People like me," I repeated. He shifted uncomfortably. I didn't mean it like that. But he had meant something, even if he didn't want to admit it. "What kind of people am I, Michael?" I asked gently. He rubbed his hands together. "You know what I mean. You're traditional, sensitive. She's more modern, direct. It just clashes sometimes." I listened carefully to every word. Traditional, sensitive, clashes. I tried to find myself in those descriptions. I couldn't decide which part was supposed to justify being slapped in my own home. "I made her a cake," I said quietly. He nodded. "I know." And she threw it away. "I know," he repeated, more firmly this time. "And I told her that wasn't okay." I looked at him for a long moment. "And?" I asked. He hesitated. "She said she'll try to be more respectful," he said finally. Respectful. That word again. As if respect was something that could be adjusted like volume on a machine. I leaned back into the couch. "Michael," I said softly, "do you think I am a burden?" His head snapped up. "What, no?" But the answer came too fast. I had learned, over time, that quick answers often hid complicated truths. "I just want everyone to get along," he said again, almost pleading. So did I. Once. But I was beginning to understand that getting along often meant one person shrinking, so the others didn't have to adjust. After he left that day, I stood at the doorway for a long time watching his car disappear down the street. He didn't look back. I closed the door slowly. And for the first time since Daniel died, I felt something unfamiliar rising in me. Not grief. Not loneliness. Awareness. Something had shifted. Not loudly. Not dramatically. But permanently. And I knew, standing there in my quiet house, that whatever came next would not be about cakes anymore. In the days that followed Michael's visit, my house began to feel like it was holding its breath around me, as if even the walls had learned to be careful with what they revealed. I moved through rooms slowly, not because I had to, but because speed felt like something that belonged to a life I no longer fully recognized. The kitchen stayed clean out of habit. The counters were wiped down more times than necessary. I told myself it was discipline, but really it was avoidance. If everything stayed in order, maybe my thoughts would too. Olivia Bennett did not contact me. Not a call, not a message, not even the kind of forced apology Michael had described. That silence, at first, felt like continuation of the insult. But as the days stretched, I realized something more unsettling. She did not see me as someone who required closure. I was not a conflict in her mind. I was an inconvenience already resolved. That realization settled inside me heavier than the slap itself. I found myself remembering small details about her now, things I had not paid attention to before. The way she placed her purse on the table before sitting, as if marking territory. The way she corrected Michael gently but constantly, like shaping him in real time. The way she looked at my home not with curiosity, but with assessment. I had mistaken her politeness for neutrality. It was not neutral at all. It was measurement. And I had failed it. That thought should have made me angry immediately, but instead, it made me tired. I began taking walks in the late afternoons, not because I enjoyed them, but because staying inside too long made my memories feel louder. The streets of Los Angeles had a way of distracting me without asking permission. People moving quickly, conversations passing by in fragments, cars sounding like distant arguments that never resolved. One afternoon, I stopped near a small park. Children were playing near the swings, their voices sharp and unfiltered in a way adults lose without noticing. I watched them for a long time, thinking about Michael at that age, about how easy it had been to know what he needed back then: water, food, attention, reassurance. Now he needed something I could not easily identify, and I was no longer the person he came to for it. A woman nearby was talking on the phone, laughing softly. I caught only pieces of her conversation, something about dinner plans and a weekend trip. Ordinary things. The kind of ordinariness that feels like luxury only when you are outside of it. I sat on a bench and let the sun warm my hands. That was when I noticed my phone vibrating. Unknown number. I almost ignored it, but something in me, habit, curiosity, or maybe the need to interrupt my own thoughts, made me answer. Hello. There was a pause on the other end. Then a voice. Female. Controlled. Claire. It took me a second. Olivia, I said. Another pause, shorter this time. I wanted to call you, she said carefully, about what happened. I looked out at the park again, at children who had no idea that grown-up conversations could carry weight long after they ended. I see, I replied. I didn't mean for things to get exaggerated, she continued. Michael is very emotional about you. He always takes your side. That sentence landed strangely. Not as apology. Not as confession. As positioning. I didn't call to argue, she added quickly. I just think there was a misunderstanding. I stayed quiet. Misunderstanding. That word had become very convenient in my life. I didn't think a cake would be such a big deal, she said. I closed my eyes slightly. It wasn't about the cake, I said softly. Another pause. Then what was it about? She asked. And there it was. The question that revealed everything she still did not see. I watched a child miss the swing and laugh anyway, as if failure had no authority over joy. It was about how you looked at me, I said finally. Silence on her end. I could hear faint background noise. Maybe her office, maybe a cafe, somewhere she was still fully in her life while I was briefly pulled into it. I don't think I looked at you any particular way, she said. I nodded slowly, even though she could not see it. That's what makes it worse, I replied. She didn't answer immediately. When she spoke again, her tone had changed slightly. Less careful now, more defended. Claire, I respect you. You're Michael's mother, but you have to understand we live differently. Standards are different now. Standards. There it was again. As if respect had been replaced with formatting rules. I understand, I said, though I wasn't sure I did. Another pause. I think it would be better if we keep some distance for now, she said finally. For everyone's peace. For everyone's peace. It sounded clean, organized, final. I see, I repeated. And then I heard the sound I had not expected. Not apology. Not regret. Relief. Subtle but unmistakable. Thank you for understanding, she said. The call ended before I could respond. I remained seated on the bench for a long time afterward, phone still in my hand, as if it might explain what had just happened more clearly if I stared at it long enough. Around me, life continued without interruption. A dog barked in the distance. A couple argued softly while walking past me, their disagreement already dissolving into laughter before it could fully form. I realized then that the world did not pause for emotional clarity. It simply moved on. That night I did not cook. I did not clean. I did not even turn on the television. I sat in my living room with the lights off, listening to the quiet of my own house. For the first time, I allowed myself to think something I had been avoiding since Daniel died. I was not just alone. I was being edited out. Not violently, not loudly, but steadily, carefully, as if my presence needed to be reduced until it no longer disturbed the structure of someone else's life. I thought about Olivia's words again: standards, misunderstanding, distance. And I began to see something forming underneath all of it. Not just conflict, not just cruelty, but hierarchy. And I was not at the top of it. The realization should have broken me further. Instead, it did something else. It clarified me. I stood up slowly, walked to the kitchen, and opened the cabinet where I kept the baking ingredients. Flour, sugar, vanilla, eggs. All still there. Waiting. I stared at them for a long time. Then I closed the cabinet. Not because I was done, but because I finally understood that what had been broken in me was not my ability to give. It was my willingness to be unseen while giving. And that was something I could no longer afford. After that night of silence, something in my routine began to change in ways that were so subtle I almost didn't notice them at first. I stopped waiting for my phone to ring. Not because I had accepted being forgotten, but because I began to understand that waiting had become a habit that hurt more than the absence itself. Every vibration that didn't come felt like a small confirmation of something I didn't want to name. So I stopped checking. I placed the phone face down on tables. I left it in another room when I moved around the house. I told myself it was peace I was choosing, but deep down, I knew it was something closer to withdrawal. Michael did not call again for several days. When he finally did, I was in the middle of folding laundry I didn't need to fold. The sound of his name on the screen made my chest tighten before I even answered. "Hi, Mom," he said. His voice carried something different this time. Less hesitation, more distance that had been practiced. "Hi," I replied, sitting down slowly on the edge of my bed. There was a pause, but not the kind that asked for permission anymore. This one felt already decided. "I think it's better if we keep things simple for a while," he said. I didn't respond immediately. I waited because I wanted to understand what simple meant in his new vocabulary. He continued. "Olivia feels uncomfortable after everything that happened, and honestly, things have been tense between us too." I closed my eyes for a moment. "I see," I said softly. "I still care about you," he added quickly, like the sentence needed correction before it could stand on its own. "But I think we need space, just until things settle." Space. That word again. It was becoming the most polite way to describe distance without admitting rejection. "How much space?" I asked gently. Another pause. "I don't know," he admitted. "A while." A while. A word without edges. A word that could stretch into anything. I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. "All right," I said. There was relief in his exhale. I heard it clearly, even through the phone. "Thank you, Mom," he said. And then the call ended. I sat there holding the phone, long after the screen went dark. It wasn't anger I felt. Not exactly. It was something quieter, more humiliating in its stillness. I was not being fought with. I was being managed. As if I were a complication that needed time to cool down before being handled again. That evening, I went outside earlier than usual. The air was warm, but not comforting. I walked past houses where people were cooking dinner, where lights flickered on one by one like small confirmations of belonging. I passed a woman watering her plants. She smiled at me politely. I smiled back automatically. We both understood nothing about each other's lives, and yet we performed friendliness like a shared language. I kept walking until the streets became quieter. I found myself near a small diner I had never entered before. The kind of place that looked like it had survived longer than it expected to. Neon sign flickering slightly, booths visible through the window. I went inside without thinking too much about it. The smell of coffee hit me first, then fried food, then something warm and familiar that didn't belong to memory, but still felt like it brushed against it. I sat in a corner booth. A waitress approached me. Young, tired eyes. She asked what I wanted. "Just coffee," I said. She nodded and left. I looked around the diner. There were people eating alone, couples speaking quietly, a man reading something on his phone with his food untouched. Ordinary life. Not perfect, not dramatic, just ongoing. When the coffee arrived, I wrapped my hands around the cup even though it wasn't cold. The warmth felt grounding. And then, without warning, I thought of Olivia Bennet again. Not her voice this time. Not the slap. Not even the cake. I thought of her relief. The relief I had heard when the call ended. That was what stayed with me. Not the insult. Not the cruelty. But the certainty that I had become something easier to remove than to understand. I stirred my coffee slowly, even though it didn't need stirring. For the first time, I allowed myself to ask a question I had avoided since Daniel died. What do I become in other people's stories when I am no longer useful to them? I didn't have an answer, but I felt the shape of one forming. When I returned home that night, the house felt different again. Not emptier, not louder, just more honest, as if something had finally stopped pretending. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time, staring at the surface. Then I opened a drawer I hadn't touched in months. Inside were old letters, some from Daniel, some from friends who had moved away, some birthday cards from Michael when he was still young enough to sign them with uneven handwriting. I picked one up. "Love you, Mom," it said in crooked letters. I traced it with my finger. That version of love felt like it belonged to a different lifetime. Not gone, but unreachable. I placed the card back carefully. And then I noticed something else in the drawer. A small notebook. Old recipes. Daniel's favorite meals. Michael's childhood favorites. Notes written in the margins like memories trying to stay useful. I didn't cry. Not yet. Instead, I closed the drawer slowly. And in that quiet motion, I realized something that frightened me more than the slap, more than Olivia's words, more than Michael's distance. I was still waiting to be chosen again by people who had already moved forward without me. And that waiting, more than anything else, was what was keeping me stuck inside a version of life where I no longer had a place. That night, I didn't sleep easily. Not because of sadness, but because something inside me had started shifting. Not loudly, not dramatically, but irreversibly. And for the first time since Daniel Carter died, I didn't know if I was becoming someone who would accept being forgotten, or someone who would finally stop allowing it. The days that followed felt like a slow rearrangement of my life, as if someone had quietly moved the furniture of my existence while I was still sitting in the room. Nothing obvious changed at first. The morning still arrived in the same way, soft light through the curtains, distant traffic beginning to build, the faint sound of life starting again outside my window. I still made tea. I still opened the blinds. I still washed the same cups and placed them in the same cupboard. But inside all of that repetition, something had shifted in how I moved through it. I was no longer performing a life that expected return. I was just living it. Michael's absence became more defined with each passing day, not in a dramatic, emotional way, but in the quiet realization that certain conversations were no longer available to me. There were no updates about his work, no casual "How are you, Mom?" messages, no small photos sent without reason. The thread that once connected us had not snapped, it had simply stopped being pulled from the other side. Olivia Bennet did not appear again in my world either, but she didn't need to. Her presence had already done what it needed to do. It had redefined my position in their lives without requiring her to ever step into my house again. One afternoon, I went to the grocery store out of necessity more than desire. The fluorescent lights inside felt harsher than usual, or maybe I was just noticing them differently now that I wasn't rushing through aisles with a purpose. I stood in front of the bakery section for longer than I intended, staring at packaged cakes wrapped in plastic, each one perfectly decorated, each one designed for a version of celebration I no longer felt included in. A woman beside me picked up a small chocolate cake and smiled at it like it meant something personal. She placed it gently into her cart. I wondered who she was buying it for. A child? A partner herself? I realized I hadn't bought a cake for anyone in a long time. Not because I couldn't, but because I no longer knew who would receive it without turning it into something I had to apologize for. At the checkout counter, the cashier asked me if I found everything okay. It was a routine question, said without meaning. Yes, I replied automatically. But as I said it, I wondered what everything was supposed to include. Because I had everything I physically needed, and still felt like something essential was missing. That evening, I received an email from Michael. Not a call, not a message, an email. It felt formal before I even opened it. The subject line simply said, "Hope you're okay." I sat at the kitchen table for a long time before clicking it. The message was short. He said work had been busy, that life was a bit complicated right now, that he hoped I was taking care of myself. He mentioned Olivia only once, briefly, in a sentence that felt carefully placed rather than naturally written. She's been stressed, but things are better now. No apology, no reference to what had happened, no acknowledgement of the moment that had changed everything between us. Just maintenance language. The kind people use when they want to preserve distance without numbing it. I read it twice, then a third time, and finally closed the laptop. I didn't reply immediately. Not because I was angry, but because I was beginning to understand that my immediate responses were part of a pattern I had never questioned before. A pattern where I adjusted myself quickly so others could remain comfortable. That night, I didn't cook. Instead, I sat on the couch with a blanket around my shoulders and watched nothing on television. The screen played quietly in the background, but I wasn't paying attention to it. My thoughts were elsewhere. They kept returning to Daniel Carter. Not the illness, not the hospital, but earlier days, simpler days. The way he used to come home and place his keys in the same bowl every time, as if order could protect us from unpredictability. The way he used to listen fully when I spoke, not interrupting, not correcting, just letting my words exist without being measured against anything else. I wondered what he would have thought of the version of me sitting there now. Not weaker, not stronger, just rearranged by absence. The next morning, I decided to walk further than I usually did. I didn't tell myself it was for exercise or clarity. I didn't assign meaning to it. I simply put on my shoes and left. The streets were busier than usual. People moved with purpose, heading toward jobs, meetings, lives that required punctuality. I moved differently among them, slower, less anchored to urgency. At one point, I passed a small flower shop. The door was open, and the smell of fresh flowers drifted onto the sidewalk. Roses, lilies, something sweet and green underneath it all. I stopped without planning to. Inside, a woman arranged bouquets with careful hands. She looked up and smiled politely when she saw me. "Can I help you?" she asked. I hesitated. I wasn't sure why I had stopped. Then I heard myself say, something simple. She nodded, as if that made perfect sense. She handed me a small arrangement, white flowers, nothing extravagant. Clean, quiet. I paid for them and left. I didn't know who they were for. And that was the first time I admitted to myself that I might not need a reason anymore. Back home, I placed the flowers in a glass jar on my table. I sat across from them for a long time, watching how something living could exist so calmly without demanding explanation. My phone stayed silent that day, and I didn't check it as often. Not because I had stopped caring, but because I had started noticing something else. The space I kept reserving for others was slowly becoming the space I could use for myself. And I wasn't sure yet whether that felt like loss or beginning. The silence from Michael stretched into something that no longer felt temporary. At first, I told myself it was just a busy phase in his life. Work deadlines, Olivia's influence, the natural drift that happens when children become adults and build homes that don't always have room for the past. I repeated those explanations quietly in my mind the way people repeat prayers, not because they fully believe them, but because they don't want to face what happens if they stop. But slowly, even those explanations stopped feeling convincing. Days blended into each other in a way that made time feel less like progress and more like repetition. I would wake up, make tea, sit by the window, and watch the same street outside my house continue its life without interruption. Neighbors came and went. Deliveries arrived. Laughter occasionally broke through the air and then disappeared again. Everything outside kept moving forward while something inside me stayed suspended between acceptance and resistance. I began noticing small things about my own behavior. How I hesitated before reaching for my phone in the morning. How I paused longer than necessary before opening cupboards. How I started speaking less, even when there was no one around to listen. It wasn't sadness exactly. It was something quieter, like my voice was slowly losing its habit of being used. One afternoon, I received a notification that made my hands stop for a moment. A payment confirmation. From Michael. It was small, not money I needed, not something dramatic, just a transfer labeled vaguely as support. I stared at it for a long time. Not because I needed the amount, but because of what it represented. Distance formalized. Care converted into transaction. It wasn't the absence of love that hurt in that moment. It was the shape it had taken instead. I didn't respond. I didn't thank him. I didn't acknowledge it at all. I simply closed the notification and placed the phone face down on the table, as if not looking at it would make it less real. That evening, I went out again. Not to anywhere specific. Just away from the stillness of my house. The sky was turning soft orange when I reached a small roadside cafe. It was not the kind of place I used to go when Daniel was alive. Back then, we preferred familiar places, quiet restaurants where waiters recognized us, where our order didn't need explanation. But now, unfamiliarity felt less intimidating than memory. I sat outside. Ordered nothing at first. Just watched people pass. A young couple sat a few tables away, laughing over something on a shared phone screen. Their ease felt effortless, like something they had never had to think about. A man nearby was reading a newspaper, occasionally shaking his head at something written there. Life continued in fragments around me, none of it asking for my participation. When the waiter came again, I ordered coffee I didn't particularly want. It arrived too hot to drink immediately. So I just held it. And in that pause, something unexpected happened. I stopped thinking about Olivia Bennet. Not because I had forgiven her. Not because I had understood her. But because my mind, for the first time in a long while, didn't automatically return to the moment of the cake, or the slap, or the silence afterward. Instead, I found myself thinking about something else entirely. My own mother. A woman who had once told me, long before I became a wife, that life does not always explain itself to the people living it. That sometimes you only understand what happened after you stop waiting for it to make sense. I hadn't understood her then. I thought she was being vague. Now I wondered if she was being honest. When I returned home that night, I noticed something different about the house. Not physically, but in how I entered it. I didn't rush in the way I used to when I was younger and more anxious to be somewhere safe. I didn't immediately check rooms or adjust things or fill silence with motion. I stood at the doorway for a moment longer than usual, as if acknowledging that I was entering a space that belonged entirely to me now, not as a temporary condition, but as a fact. Inside, the flowers I had bought earlier were beginning to open slightly. I sat across from them again, and I realized I was no longer trying to imagine who they were for. They were simply there. So was I. That night, I finally opened Michael's email again. This time, I read it differently. Not as a message asking for response, but as a statement of his current distance. And I understood something that had been forming quietly beneath all the confusion. He was not coming back into my life in the way he once existed in it. Not because something was broken beyond repair, but because life had moved him into another version of himself where I was no longer central. It didn't feel like betrayal anymore. It felt like gravity, unavoidable. And once I accepted that, something strange happened. The pressure I had been carrying in my chest for weeks didn't disappear. But it loosened. Not enough to feel free, but enough to breathe differently. I set the laptop down and looked around my quiet house. For the first time, I stopped asking when things would return to how they were before. And instead, I asked something I had avoided since Daniel Carter died. What does life look like when before is no longer an option? And I didn't have an answer. But I was no longer afraid of not having one immediately. The question I had asked myself that night didn't leave me. It stayed with me in the background of everything I did, like a quiet presence that didn't demand attention but refused to disappear. What does life look like when before is no longer an option? I began noticing how often I used the past as a reference point. Not just Daniel Carter, not just Michael's childhood, but even smaller things. The way I used to bake without thinking, the way conversations used to feel easier, the way I used to assume I had a defined place in people's lives. Everything I compared my present to belonged to a version of me that no longer existed in the same way. One morning, I found myself standing in front of the mirror longer than usual. Not inspecting myself, just observing. My face didn't look unfamiliar, but it looked less anchored, like someone who had been living through too many transitions without fully arriving at any of them. I touched my cheek lightly where Olivia Bennet had slapped me, though the physical mark had long faded. What remained wasn't on the skin anymore. It was somewhere deeper, harder to locate. I whispered my own name. Claire. It sounded ordinary. But I realized I had stopped hearing it from others with the same warmth. That day, I decided to do something I hadn't done in a long time. I went through Daniel Carter's old belongings. Not out of grief, not out of longing, but because I needed something solid that belonged to a time when I still understood my role in the world more clearly. His closet still held a few shirts I had never given away. His scent was gone, of course, but the memory of it lingered in the fabric in a way my mind filled in automatically. I held one of his shirts for a long time before folding it again carefully and placing it back. I found a small notebook tucked into a drawer. His handwriting. Notes from years ago, lists, reminders, small observations about work and life. At the very end of one page, there was a sentence that made me stop. People don't always change who they are. Sometimes they just stop being seen the same way. I sat down on the floor, reading it again. And again. It didn't feel like advice. It felt like something he had written, without knowing it would matter later. That evening, I cooked dinner for myself properly for the first time in weeks. Not because I was trying to reclaim anything, but because I suddenly felt like I could. The act itself felt unfamiliar in a way that wasn't uncomfortable, just new. Like rediscovering a skill you didn't realize you had stopped using. As I ate, I thought about Olivia Bennet again, but differently this time. Not as someone who had insulted me, but as someone who had defined me too narrowly in her mind, and then acted according to that definition. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. But it was distance from emotional reaction. And that distance made room for something else. Understanding, not of her actions, but of the structure she represented. People who categorize others quickly. People who decide what value looks like. People who confuse control with clarity. And I had allowed myself to be placed inside that system without question. My phone rang late that night. Unknown number again. For a brief second, my chest tightened instinctively, but I didn't hesitate as long as I used to. I answered. Hello. A pause. Then Olivia Bennet's voice again. But different this time. Less controlled. More uneven. Claire, she said. I didn't respond immediately. She continued. I think I should have handled things differently. I sat down slowly. Not because I was shocked, but because I was listening more carefully now. I didn't mean to disrespect you, she said, and for the first time, there was something close to uncertainty in her tone. I don't know how to deal with expectations from family sometimes. Family. That word again. I looked at the kitchen table in front of me. Empty. Quiet. I understand, I said slowly. There was a pause on her end, as if she was waiting for something more. Maybe anger, maybe forgiveness, maybe reassurance. But I gave none of those immediately. Instead, I said something I hadn't planned. I think you were trying to protect your idea of control, I said gently. Silence. Longer this time. Not defensive silence. Reflective silence. I didn't think about it like that, she admitted finally. I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. I know, I said. Another pause. Then she spoke again, softer. Michael is worried about you. That sentence surprised me more than I expected. Not because it was new information, but because it suggested she was not only thinking about herself in this conversation. I'm fine, I said. And for the first time, I wasn't lying to make her comfortable. I was stating, something I was still learning to believe. There was a final pause before she said, okay. And then the call ended. I didn't feel resolved afterward. But I didn't feel shaken either. I just sat there, holding the silence in a different way than before. Not as abandonment, but as space. That night, I didn't go to bed immediately. I stayed at the table for a long time, thinking about something new. Not what I had lost. Not what I had been denied. But what kind of person I had become in response. And for the first time since Daniel Carter's death, I realized I wasn't only being shaped by what others had done to me. I was also starting to shape something back. Quietly. Carefully. Not as revenge. Not as forgiveness. But as redefinition. And I didn't yet know where it would lead. But I no longer felt like I was only being moved through life. I was beginning, however slightly, to move within it again. After that call with Olivia Bennett, something subtle changed in the way I carried my days. Not externally. The world around me remained the same streets, same neighbors, same quiet mornings where sunlight crept into the kitchen without asking permission. But internally, there was a shift in how I responded to what came toward me. I no longer absorbed every silence as rejection immediately. I no longer treated every absence as proof of erasure. It didn't mean I was healed. It meant I was paying attention differently. Michael still did not call. But I had stopped measuring my worth in the frequency of his contact. That realization did not come as a sudden breakthrough. It came gradually, like light adjusting in a room after you open a curtain slightly. At first, everything is still dim. Then shapes begin to separate from shadows. Then you realize you were seeing more than you thought you were. I started taking longer walks in the evenings. Not because I was trying to escape anything, but because I noticed I was no longer as afraid of being alone in public spaces. One evening, I walked further than usual and ended up near a small community library. I had passed it many times before but never entered. That day, I stopped outside and looked at it for a long time, as if deciding whether I was allowed to step inside a place that wasn't required for survival. Eventually, I went in. The air inside was cooler, quieter in a different way than my house. Not empty quiet, organized quiet, the kind that suggests purpose rather than absence. A woman at the front desk greeted me with a soft nod. Looking for anything specific, she asked. I hesitated. No, I said, just looking. She smiled as if that was enough. I walked between shelves slowly. Books lined up in patient rows, each one waiting for someone to pick it up and give it attention. I realized I hadn't been in a library for years, not since before Daniel Carter became ill, not since life began to shrink into responsibilities rather than exploration. Without planning to, I found myself in a section of memoirs. Stories of people who had lost things. Husbands, children, homes, versions of themselves. I pulled one book out and opened it randomly. A sentence caught my attention immediately. You don't move on from loss, you move forward with it. I stood there for a long time holding the book. Something about that sentence didn't feel comforting in a simple way. It felt accurate in a way that didn't allow denial. I checked the book out. That night, I read longer than I had in months. Not because I was trying to understand my own life through someone else's story, but because I was realizing I had been avoiding stories altogether. Not just fiction or nonfiction, but any structured reflection of pain that didn't belong to me directly. Reading felt like stepping into a controlled version of confusion, where there were sentences instead of silence. The next morning, I received a message from Michael. Not a call. A message. Short. Hope you're okay. Busy week. Talk soon. I stared at it for a while. Something inside me reacted automatically at first. Old habit. Old expectation. Then I noticed something different. The message no longer felt like emotional direction. It felt like information. And that changed how my body responded to it. I replied later than I would have before. Okay, take care. Simple. No explanation. No emotional weight added. Just acknowledgement. And after sending it, I did not reopen the conversation repeatedly. I did not wait for a response like it was an event that would define my day. Instead, I went back to the book I had started the night before. There was something quietly powerful about shifting attention away from what I could not control. Later that afternoon, I went to the grocery store again. This time, I noticed people differently. Not as background characters in my loneliness, but as individuals with their own unspoken stories. A man carefully choosing fruit as if precision mattered deeply to him. A young woman laughing quietly into her phone as she compared prices on a list. An older couple moving slowly but together, pausing to argue gently about which brand of tea to buy. Life was still happening everywhere. Not centered on me. Not against me. Just continuing. At the checkout, the cashier asked the usual question again. Did you find everything okay? This time, I paused before answering. Yes, I said. And I meant it in a way I hadn't before. That evening, I sat again at my kitchen table, but instead of silence feeling like emptiness, it felt like space that was mine to use. I opened Daniel Carter's old notebook again. Not to grieve. Not to remember. But to understand something I had missed before. There was another line I hadn't paid attention to earlier. You can't rebuild life in the shape of what you lost. You have to learn its new geometry. Geometry. The word stayed with me. Because it implied structure. Not chaos. Not emptiness. Structure that had changed form. I looked around my kitchen slowly. It was the same room. But I was no longer occupying it the same way. And somewhere inside that realization, I understood something quietly significant. I was no longer waiting for my life to return to what it was before Olivia Bennett's slap, before Michael's distance, before all of it. I was beginning, slowly, unevenly, to accept that life had already moved into a different shape. And I was still here inside it, learning how to exist within it instead of outside it. By the time I reached what felt like the 9th layer of this strange new rhythm of my life, I no longer measured my days by who called me or who didn't. That alone felt like a quiet shift I couldn't fully explain. It wasn't happiness. It wasn't peace in the way people describe it in comforting words. It was something more neutral than that, like standing in a room after a storm has passed, where everything is still slightly wet, slightly rearranged, but no longer actively breaking. Michael's presence in my life had become occasional rather than expected. His messages came like distant weather reports, short, practical, emotionally restrained. Busy week. Work is intense. Hope you're okay. I responded in the same tone now. Not because I had stopped loving him, but because I had stopped chasing the version of connection that required me to shrink myself in order to maintain it. Olivia Bennett remained a quiet name in my thoughts, but no longer the center of them. What stayed with me instead was not her personality, but what she represented, a moment in which I had been clearly shown how little space I occupied in someone else's idea of importance. And I had survived it. That fact began to matter more than I expected. One afternoon, I received something unexpected in the mail. A small envelope. No return address I immediately recognized. Inside was a folded note. Short, carefully written. It was from Olivia. "Claire," it began. "I've been thinking about everything that happened. I realize I may have been unfair in how I handled things. I don't expect anything from you, but I wanted to acknowledge it properly. I'm sorry for the way I treated you that day." I read it once, then again, and then I set it down on the table without reacting immediately. The word sorry is simple on paper, but in real life, it carries layers of timing, intention, and consequence. I did not feel immediate forgiveness. I did not feel immediate anger either. What I felt was distance. Not emotional distance from her, but distance from the version of myself that used to need apologies to feel restored. I sat with that realization for a long time. Eventually, I folded the note again and placed it in the same drawer where I kept Daniel Carter's letters and Michael's childhood cards. Not because it belonged to the past, but because I was learning how to store experiences without letting them define my present moment. That evening, I went for another walk. The air was cooler than usual. The sky carried that soft, fatting light that makes everything look temporarily gentler than it is. I passed familiar streets, but I noticed something new. I was no longer scanning them for emotional meaning. I was just moving through them. At a small intersection, I saw a woman standing alone with groceries, struggling slightly to adjust the bags in her hands. Without thinking too deeply about it, I walked over and helped her steady them. She looked at me and smiled. "Thank you," she said. It was simple, ordinary. But as I walked away, I realized something stayed with me longer than expected. The interaction had not changed my life, but it had reminded me that I still existed in it in a functional way. Not as someone waiting to be chosen, but as someone capable of participating in moments without emotional negotiation. That night, I sat again with Daniel Carter's notebook. But instead of reading memories, I started noticing patterns. His way of thinking was structured, practical, observational. He wrote about problems as things to be understood, not just endured. I wondered when I had stopped thinking like that, or if I ever truly had. Somewhere along the line, after his illness, after his death, after Michael built his own life, I had slowly turned inward, not in reflection, but in containment. Life became something I managed rather than experienced. And Olivia Bennett's arrival had shattered that containment in the most painful way possible. But now, sitting in my quiet kitchen, I realized something unexpected. That break had not only taken something from me, it had also removed something that no longer served me. The need to be endlessly accommodating. The need to remain small in order to be acceptable. The need to interpret disrespect as misunderstanding, just to keep relationships intact. I wasn't grateful for how it happened, but I was beginning to understand what it had exposed. My phone buzzed again that night. Michael. This time, not a message. A call. I stared at the screen for a moment, longer than I used to. Then I answered. "Hi, Mom," he said. His voice was tired, but present. "Hi," I replied. There was a pause. Not awkward, just uncertain. I wanted to check in properly, he said. Not quickly, not just properly. That small difference mattered more than I expected. I'm okay, I said. And this time, I didn't rush to prove it. Another pause. Olivia told me she wrote to you, he added carefully. Yes, I said. Did you read it? Yes. Silence followed. Not because there was nothing to say, but because neither of us knew what version of conversation we were stepping into anymore. Finally, he said, I miss you. It was simple, unpolished, not enough to undo everything, but real enough to register. I miss you too, I said. And I meant the version of him that used to exist before distance became the default setting. We didn't resolve anything that night. We didn't rebuild anything either. But something shifted slightly in the air between us. Not reconciliation, not repair, but acknowledgement. After the call ended, I didn't sit in silence the same way I used to. I didn't wait for meaning to form around it. Instead, I stood up, walked to the kitchen, and poured myself a glass of water. And as I held it, I realized something simple but important. I was no longer only the person things happened to. I was also the person who continued after they happened. After Michael's call, I didn't rush to assign it meaning the way I used to. That was the most noticeable change in me by then. The pause between experience and interpretation had grown longer. I was no longer instantly converting every emotional moment into a story about what it meant for my worth, my place, or my future. I was simply allowing things to exist before deciding what they were. Still, that night stayed with me. I miss you too. Those words repeated in my mind, not as hope, but as something unfinished. The next morning, I woke earlier than usual without intending to. My body had begun to develop its own rhythm, separate from emotional disturbance. The sunlight came in through the curtains in a thin, quiet line, touching the kitchen floor like it had always belonged there. I made tea. Not because I needed comfort, but because I needed motion. And motion, I had learned, was sometimes enough to keep the mind from collapsing inward. Olivia Bennett's letter was still in the drawer. I didn't reread it, but I knew exactly where it was. That awareness alone felt different from before. Earlier, I would have opened it repeatedly, searching for hidden meanings, analyzing tone, replaying sentences. Now it simply existed among other objects in my life. Not controlling the room, just occupying space in it. That afternoon, I went to a small park again. It had become a place I returned to more often without planning to. Not because it held memories, but because it held neutrality. People there were not concerned with my history or my losses. They were simply existing in their own trajectories. I sat on the same bench as before. This time, I brought nothing with me. No phone in my hand. No book to hide behind. Just myself. A man nearby was teaching his daughter how to ride a bicycle. She kept falling slightly, laughing each time she tried again. The repetition didn't frustrate her. It built something in her instead. Confidence in motion rather than certainty in outcome. I watched them for a long time. And something in me softened, not emotionally, but structurally. Like a tight knot loosening slightly without fully unraveling. I realized I had stopped allowing myself to fail in small ways without turning it into emotional evidence of inadequacy. Watching that child fall and try again reminded me that repetition was not punishment. It was learning. That evening, when I returned home, I found another message from Michael. Short again. Can we talk this weekend properly? The word properly appeared again. I stared at it for a moment, then replied. Yes. Nothing more. Not because I was withholding emotion, but because I was no longer overfilling empty spaces with unnecessary reassurance. The weekend arrived slower than I expected. Not in a frustrating way. In a grounding way. When Michael called, I answered without the usual anticipation tightening in my chest. "Hey, Mom," he said. "Hi," I replied. There was a pause, but this time it didn't feel like avoidance. It felt like structure forming. "I've been thinking," he began, "about everything. About you, about Olivia, about how things got like this." I listened without interrupting. Not because I had nothing to say, but because I wanted to understand what he had arrived at without me guiding it. "I think I didn't handle things well," he admitted. That sentence mattered. Not because it fixed anything, but because it acknowledged responsibility without deflection. "I tried to keep everyone calm," he continued, "but I think I just ended up distancing myself from you instead." I looked out the window while he spoke. The street outside was ordinary, a neighbor watering plants, a car passing slowly, life continuing without pause. "I didn't want distance," I said gently. "I know," he replied immediately. Another pause. "I should have protected you better," he said quietly. That word, protected, carried weight. But I didn't respond to it emotionally the way I might have before. "Instead," I said, "I don't need protection in the way you think I do." Silence. Not disagreement. Processing. "What do you need then?" he asked. It was the first time in a long time I felt like he was asking instead of assuming. I thought about it carefully. "I need to not be treated like I'm fragile just because I've lost things," I said. Another pause. "And I need to not feel like I have to earn my place in your life." The line went quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's fair." Simple. No resistance. No justification. Just acknowledgement. It didn't fix everything, but it shifted something. After the call ended, I sat in silence, but it wasn't the same silence I used to fear. It was no longer absence. It was space. That night, I didn't think about Olivia Bennett as much as I used to. When she did appear in my thoughts, it was no longer as the person who defined a moment of humiliation. She had become part of a larger realization about how quickly people assign roles to others without checking if those roles are accurate. And more importantly, I realized I had participated in allowing that assignment. Not by choice exactly, but by silence, by adaptation, by not resisting when I should have. I stood in front of the mirror again, before bed. My reflection looked the same, but I didn't interpret it the same way anymore. I said my name quietly again. "Claire." And this time, it didn't feel like I was trying to remind myself I existed. It felt like I was acknowledging it, not as something in question, but as something ongoing. And for the first time since Daniel Carter's death, and everything that followed after Olivia Bennett's cake, the slap, and the silence, I didn't feel like I was waiting for my life to return to me. I felt like I was still inside it, learning how to remain in it without disappearing. After that conversation with Michael, something inside me began to settle into a steadier rhythm. Not because everything had been repaired, but because I was no longer standing in a constant state of emotional anticipation. I stopped expecting sudden calls to define my entire day. I stopped treating silence as something that needed immediate explanation. The world didn't become easier, but I became less reactive to its unpredictability. Olivia Bennett did not contact me again for a while after that, and strangely, I no longer interpreted her absence as either punishment or peace. It was just another thread in a life that had many threads now, not all of them connected directly to me. One morning, I opened Daniel Carter's notebook again, not out of grief, but out of curiosity I hadn't felt before. I flipped through pages more slowly this time, noticing how practical his thinking had always been. He wrote things like plans, observations, small reflections on daily life. He didn't overdramatize experience. He documented it. And somewhere in those pages, I started seeing something I had missed before. He had written about change as something structural, not emotional. "People don't become different overnight," one line said. They stop responding to the same versions of themselves they used to live by. I closed the notebook for a moment after reading that, because it felt uncomfortably accurate. Not about him. About me. I had been responding to an older version of myself for a long time. The version that still believed love required self-erasure, that family required silence in exchange for belonging. That respect had to be earned through patience even when it wasn't given freely. And that version of me had been quietly dissolving. Not dramatically. Not all at once. But steadily, like something soft being reshaped by time. That afternoon, I went out again, this time without any particular destination in mind. I ended up near a small bookstore I hadn't noticed before. The sign above the door was slightly faded, but the place looked lived in, cared for in a quiet way. Inside, it smelled of paper and time. I wandered through the aisles slowly, not searching for anything specific. My attention wasn't drawn to any one section until I found myself near books about relationships, family, and emotional boundaries. I hesitated there longer than I expected to. Not because I was unsure, but because I was noticing something new in myself. I wasn't looking for validation anymore. I was looking for clarity. I picked up a book at random and opened it. A sentence caught my attention almost immediately. You cannot maintain closeness with people who require your disappearance in order to feel comfortable. I stood still reading it. Then I read it again, and something inside me quietly aligned. Not emotionally overwhelming, just clear. I bought the book without overthinking it. At home, I didn't rush to read it immediately. I placed it on the table and made myself dinner first. Simple food, nothing elaborate. The act itself felt grounded in a way I hadn't experienced in a long time, not as distraction, but as participation in my own life. Later that night, I finally opened the book. What I read wasn't dramatic. It wasn't filled with shock or revelation. It was steady, structured reflection about emotional boundaries, about how people often confuse control with love, and how silence in relationships is sometimes not peace but avoidance. I didn't agree with everything, but I didn't reject it either. I let it sit alongside my own experience without forcing it to match perfectly. And that, more than anything, felt like growth. My phone rang again later that evening. Unknown number. I already knew before answering. Claire, Olivia Bennett said. Her voice was different again. Not apologetic this time. Not defensive. More neutral. Almost careful. Yes, I replied. There was a pause. I wanted to check if everything is okay between us now, she said. The question surprised me, not because it existed, but because of its assumption that okay was something that could be confirmed like a status. I think things are clearer, I said after a moment. Another pause. I didn't expect to still think about what happened, she admitted quietly, but I do. That honesty was new. Not transformative, but noticeable. I understand, I said. Silence followed. Not uncomfortable, just uncertain. Then she said, I don't want there to be resentment. I considered that carefully. I don't think resentment is what I feel anymore, I said honestly. What is it then? She asked. I looked around my quiet room before answering. Distance, I said, but not the kind that hurts now, the kind that just exists. She didn't respond immediately. And for the first time, I didn't feel the need to fill the silence. Eventually, she said softly, okay. And then she ended the call. I sat there for a while afterward, noticing something subtle but important. The call had not reopened a wound. It had simply confirmed its place in my past. That was the difference now. Things no longer pulled me back into them automatically. They passed through me, and I remained. Later that night, I wrote something in a notebook of my own for the first time. Not a diary, not a confession, just a sentence. I am not who I was when I was treated that way. I stared at it for a long time, then closed the notebook. Not because I was finished, but because I no longer needed to repeat it to remember it. And in that quiet, ordinary moment, I understood something I had been moving toward without realizing. My life was not returning to what it was before Olivia Bennett's presence, before Michael's distance, before Daniel Carter's absence. It was continuing forward, without requiring permission from any of those moments anymore. After that night, something in my life stopped feeling like it was circling around the past. Not because the past disappeared. It didn't. Daniel Carter was still gone. Michael was still building a life that didn't always include me in the same way it once did. Olivia Bennett was still part of the structure that had reshaped how I understood respect, distance, and family. But none of it controlled the direction of my days anymore. That realization didn't arrive with drama. It arrived quietly, like a fact you slowly stop arguing with. Mornings became simpler. I woke up, made tea, opened the curtains, and didn't immediately reach for meaning in everything that happened or didn't happen. Some days were empty. Some were full of small, ordinary interactions. A shopkeeper remembering my order. A neighbor asking how I was and actually waiting for an answer. A phone call from Michael that was neither distant nor emotionally loaded, just conversation. We were not fixed. We were just less fractured. One afternoon, I received a short message from Olivia Bennett. It wasn't an apology this time. It wasn't an explanation either. It simply said, "I hope you're well, Claire." I read it once, and for the first time, I didn't interpret it as threat, peace, manipulation, or reconciliation. It was just a message. I replied, "I am well. Nothing more." And I meant it in a way I could not have meant months ago. That evening, I sat by the window as the light slowly faded outside. The same street, the same passing cars, the same distant sounds of life continuing. But I was no longer measuring my place in it through other people's reactions. I thought about Daniel Carter, not with the sharp ache I used to feel, but with something steadier. A kind of quiet acknowledgement that his life had shaped mine, but did not have to define its ending. I thought about Michael, and how love between a mother and son does not always disappear when it changes form. Sometimes it just stops being expressed in the same language. I thought about Olivia Bennett, not as an antagonist, but as a person who met me at a moment when I had already been reduced by grief and expectation, and reacted through her own understanding of control and identity. None of it excused what happened, but it explained the shape of it. And explanation, I was learning, was different from justification. That night, I took out Daniel's notebook one last time. Not to search for answers, but to close something properly within myself. I read the lines I had read before. Then I placed it back in the drawer gently. And I didn't feel like I was putting him away. I felt like I was placing part of my past where it belonged, still respected, still remembered, but no longer directing the present. Before going to bed, I stood in front of the mirror again. The same face. The same years lived in its lines. But something had changed in how I looked at it. I wasn't asking who I had become anymore. I was acknowledging who I already was. A widow who had been dismissed, hurt, misunderstood, reduced, and distanced. But also someone who had kept moving. Not perfectly, not loudly, but consistently. I whispered my name once. Claire. And this time, it didn't sound like a reminder. It sounded like acceptance. Not of everything that had happened, but of the fact that I had survived it without disappearing inside it. When I turned off the light that night, the silence in my house was still there. But it was no longer heavy. It was simply space. And for the first time since that cake was thrown away, since Olivia Bennett's slap, since Michael's distance began, I understood something clearly. My life had not ended in that moment. It had only changed direction. And I was still here, living it,